right. When I left you last week, at the end of the golden age of bluegrass, it was to the rollicking strains of Foggy Mountain Breakdown, being used as a soundtrack, first of all, recorded and performed by Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs and the Foggy Mountain Boys, and being used as a soundtrack for a great movie by Arthur Penn called Bonnie and Clyde. And the scene I shared with you, and for the most part, the movie itself is kind of counterculture, rebellion, and bank robbery as countercultural rebellion, and generally a good time, although it does end rather tragically if you've seen the movie or you've read the biography. But it's a double-edged sword, like a lot of great movies from that time. Think of Easy Rider and Cool Hand Luke and other films of that genre. Those are all kind of reflective of a certain moment in time in our history. And as we move forward, we'll find that the culture, both musical and otherwise, is reflective of a sort of darker period. So we have called this the Dark Ages. Now, the Dark Ages are generally a misnomer, even if we're thinking about the Middle Ages, Dark Ages, early Middle Ages. Just because it's no longer the golden age of Rome or the golden age of 1960s folk revival and bluegrass doesn't mean that the Dark Ages are without interest or culture. But it tends to be a period of considerable ferment and reevaluation and a search for new meaning when the old meaning has fallen apart. So in any event, as a counterpoint to the rollicking good times of Bonnie and Clyde, I want to start today's lecture with an excerpt from a different film. Some of you perhaps have seen this film. The scene I'm about to show you is pretty much the last joyful moment of the film. $4.99.
About genetic deficiencies. Isn't that pitiful?
Who's picking the banjo here?
Well, Burt Reynolds rarely looked better. And I have to say the rural South rarely looked worse. And that's part of the theme here. Whereas in the 60s, rural Southern culture, white culture and black culture, musically and otherwise, was really seen as sort of a preserved folk spirit, a source for possible renewal and authenticity, especially for a young urban generation, as we talked about. The rural white South especially had really been poorly represented in media over the course of the civil rights movement, not just in the media, but by unfortunately prominent representatives. And there's sort of this backlash, this swing back in Deliverance, where all of a sudden rural white culture is seen not as this pure, authentic source of of culture and truth and meaning, but rather perhaps something very menacing, something dark, something distorted. And that's incredibly powerful in this movie and already apparent in this clip. And this sort of, all of a sudden you have sort of a northern Yankee chauvinism against the Southerners instead of an affection and interest in them. So that's part of what's happening here. Another thing that's happening is this, the song itself went on to become one of the biggest hits, the biggest banjo hits of all time. And really, it has to be called a bluegrass tune. And it's played in a classic Scruggs style, banjo style. It's called Dueling Banjos. And it features two musicians, Steve Mandel and Eric Weisberg. Eric Weisberg is still here, lives in the Hudson Valley near Woodstock, an active musician with a storied career. Among other things, he was one of the founding members of the Greenbrier Boys that we looked into a little bit last week. So another way in which this is sort of a dark age and contentious and not as rosy as the previous decade we were talking about is it turns out that this was not an old, pure folk spirit tune. This song was assumed to be public domain. It was recorded as such, put on the soundtrack to Deliverance, and was a #2 single for 4 weeks. It couldn't displace Roberta Flack's Killing Me Softly with his song. But it was a huge hit. And it caught the attention of its composer, Mr. Arthur Smith. He wrote the tune, and it was actually called Feuding Banjos in 1955. So not really so far back that no one could have remembered it. But it had quotes from Yankee Doodle Dandy and just it was so well written that it really sounded like it must have been around for a long time. He recorded it with Don Reno, a major bluegrass banjo player. But he had not been given credit on the soundtrack, and Smith had to proceed with legal action, and in order to get his due as a songwriter. And there was a settlement. It was a fairly prominent suit, and he was given his fair share as well. Now, interestingly, Arthur Smith passed away a few weeks ago. I think this was, earlier this month. Arthur Smith, who wrote Dueling Banjos, died at the age of 93, just earlier this month. Interestingly, here he is on his very own variety show, The Arthur Smith Show, so it gives you a sense of his prominence. And you probably recognize his guest, Andy Griffith. Interestingly, the tune Feuding Banjos had its first wide-scale hearing on The Andy Griffith Show. And it was performed by the resident band, known on the TV show as the Darlings, but known in real life as the Dillards, a major West Coast bluegrass group. So Feuding Banjos was floating around, and it originally sounded like this. Interestingly, very different from the kind of rural, old-timey, stripped-down treatment that it had in early 70s, where it's supposed to represent the rural South. Instead, this is the mid-50s, and this is the height of sort of cosmopolitan Nashville sound. And you'll see this Feuding Banjos is still fairly sophisticated, almost jazzy. Makes you wonder who's picking banjo here. So that was the original Feuding Banjos, a source of a feud all its own. All right. So what were other people up to in the early 70s? We met these fellows previously. These are what we're affectionately referring to as Sons of Bill, musicians both of whom came through the Bill Monroe Bluegrass Boys band. Peter Rowan on the left, guitarist and singer and songwriter, and Vassar Clements, fiddler, and ultimately a band leader as well. Well, as I pointed out last time we saw this picture, you can see Peter Rowan has embraced the spirit of the 60s and early 70s, And Vassar did too, though not so much in dress as it was in musical style. We're quickly receding. In the rearview mirror behind us are the sharp suits, hats, jodhpurs, string ties of the Bluegrass Boys and the Foggy Mountain Boys, the well-pressed suits. Rather, we're getting kind of the free spirit, everyone do your own thing. And here's the thing that Peter Rowan was doing.
I'll meet you at Alamo Mission. We can say alright. The Holy Ghost and the Virgin Mother will heal us as we kneel there in the moonlight, in the midnight, in the moonlight, midnight moonlight, in the moonlight, in the midnight, in the moonlight, midnight moonlight.
So all of a sudden we're getting songs written ever less in the mold of traditional fiddle tunes and traditional folk songs, and the lyrics are becoming more poetic, or poetic in a different way, in a more modern style, maybe even a little surreal. Here's a nice clip of Vassar Clements playing the Florida Blues. One of the things you can start to get a sense for also is instrumentally the ever more complex and acrobatic style that I think Ambrose, our first week, talked about. You know, as you move forward in time, the demands upon the instruments became ever greater. Everyone was responsible for what everyone previous had done. Gene Lowinger talked about having to learn every fiddle break that every fiddler in the Bill Monroe band before him had learned, etc. You were expected to be encyclopedic in your understanding. All right. Well, interestingly, Peter Rowan and Vassar Clements joined forces with a couple other characters we've met, one of whom is David Grisman. Remember, he was a bandmate of Gene Lowinger's in the New York Ramblers. Well, Peter Rowan, Vassar Clements, and a fellow from the West Coast got together and formed a band called Old and in the Way. All right. You may recognize the banjo player on the left. It's Mr. Jerry Garcia. Now, these are the young bucks. Interesting that they call themselves Old in the Way, or perhaps that's a sly double meaning and a nudge at their forebears. But you can see not quite as clean cut as the Bluegrass Boys. I mean, they've got the beards, they've got the tie-dyed shirts, but there's Vassar, looking sharp. His style never hardly changed at all. He's got that white leather belt and everything. But these guys are now listening more broadly. These are folks who did not grow up in Rosine, Kentucky. They did not have their Uncle Penn playing fiddle tunes for them. Their experience of the world is one through radio and records. I just was reading an interesting reflection on the advent of the LP record in 1948. And what that meant, I guess the big ad campaign was the inventor of the LP holding a handful comfortably under his arm, standing next to a stack of 78s, 7 feet tall, to represent the equivalent amount, what we would today call an equivalent amount of data. And of course, we have the same thing now. What we can carry around musically in a thumb drive is just astounding. But so these are folks who have grown up since Elvis Presley, for whom Elvis Presley was not necessarily a direct rival and an encroacher, as it was for Bill Monroe, but rather something of an inspiration. So here you'll find an interesting cover by Old and in the Way, a cover being a song written by someone other than the performer. Let's see if you recognize this.
Graceless lady, you know who I am.
Anybody recognize I can identify the original of that song? Anybody know who the original artist is? Shout it out if you know it. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, The Rolling Stones. That is a Rolling Stones song. Released only about 5 or 6 years prior. This version was recorded in 1974. It doesn't sound like the Rolling Stones. But some would also ask whether it sounds quite like bluegrass. The instrumentation is right. There's some nice harmonies. But it certainly lopes along. And this ain't your father's bluegrass music. Kind of to give another illustration of this generational shift, I want to look at another artist by the name of John Hartford, whose name you may or may not be familiar with, but I'm sure you'll be familiar with his biggest composition. It was a huge hit and pretty much made his career. It was one of his earliest compositions. John Hartford was working in Nashville, and he was in the house band for a good friend, Glenn Campbell, there. It was Glenn Campbell who had the really big hit, but it was with the John Hartford composition. And here they are doing it on the TV show.
It's knowing that your door is always open and your path is free to walk. That makes me tend to leave my sleeping bag rolled up and stashed behind your couch. And it's knowing I'm not shackled by forgotten words and bonds and the ink stains that have dried upon someone. That keeps you in the back roads by the rivers of my memory. It keeps you ever gentle on my mind.
It's not clinging to the rocks and ivy planted on their columns now that bind me, or something that somebody said because they thought we fit together walking.
Now, I would not try to make the case that this is a bluegrass song by any means. This, again, like the Arthur Smith version of Feuding Banjos that we heard, is sort of perfect cosmopolitan Nashville-style country music. But there it is, that gurgling banjo by its composer, John Hartford. And he was definitely plugged into what people like Olden in the Way were doing. And in fact, he was so successful on account of the song Gentle on My Mind and the work with Glenn Campbell that he too felt free to pursue wherever his muse took him. And here's where it took him. Yes, indeed. That's John Hartford, 1972. Hardly recognize him under all that, right? This is a wonderful album, until recently very hard to find on CD. You had to have the LP. This wonderful album called Aeroplane, and I'm going to give you a little excerpt of a song called Steam-Powered Aeroplane. Take a trip with John Hartford.
Well, I drifted away on a steam-powered airplane. I went interstate and I damn near didn't come back again. I didn't go very fast on a steam-powered airplane. Oh, the wheel went around and up and down and inside and then back again. Sitting in a 747 just watching them clouds roll by. Can't tell if it's sunshine or if it's rain. I'd rather be sitting in a deck chair high up over Kansas City on a genuine, old-fashioned, authentic steam-powered aeroplane.
John Hartford, something of a genre unto himself, but really he plays a lot more in the bluegrass sandbox from this moment on. The musicians he collaborates with, the instrumentation, there is an electric bass there, but then you heard at the very end a nice dobro sliding in from Tut Taylor. He worked with Norman Blake, a very prominent bluegrass guitarist. And so, again, so we have this mix of an old-fashioned sound being made to do all kinds of acrobatics to serve a very different sensibility. All right. I'm going to give you a taste of yet another sensibility. We we heard about this other band, and that ended up being called the Bluegrass Revival. In fact, their name came to be the label for all of this, what we might call progressive, new kind of bluegrass music. It started to be called Newgrass, just in the same way that the band name of the Bluegrass Boys eventually came to stand in for the genre of bluegrass. The Bluegrass Revival, the band's name, came to represent a whole wing of bluegrass music. And Joan, the banjo player from 2 weeks ago, had a nice story about Bill Monroe meeting up with Sam Bush, the fellow you see here, the mandolin player, and saying, "Now, what is it you call that style of music again that you're playing?" And he says, "What?" He says, "They're calling it newgrass." He says, "Yeah, I don't like it. That's the stuff I don't like." Well, at least as famous a quote, probably almost more so, from Bill Monroe. Whenever he wanted to dismiss something, it was, "That ain't no part of nothing." And this is definitely an assessment he would have made of the Newgrass Revival, and did. Newgrass Revival also formed in the early 70s. This particular performance is from now the early 80s. And here you can see the full flower of, I'm going to mix my metaphor, but the dam has really broken. And it's watering all kinds of strange flowers. All right, so you have now electric bass in this band. You have a banjo player who's playing, I believe in this clip also, sort of an electric banjo. It is a song that is really a reggae song, reggae being a genre inspired by kind of Caribbean, Jamaican flavors and rhythms. But as Sam Bush will tell you, it was actually a song written by an old friend of ours.
Well, howdy, folks, and welcome to New Country. We're Newgrass Revival, and tonight we're going to be doing all new tunes off of our brand new EMI America record, cleverly titled Newgrass Revival. And right now, we're going to feature a song written by a good friend of ours, Mr. Pete Rowan. This is a reggae-style number called Revival.
So there you have it. Even the lyrics are sort of a declaration of independence. Right? I'm tired of hearing about how my feelings are all wrong. I'm going to take those feelings and put them in a song. Or how I'm living. Tired of hearing how I'm living is all wrong. I'm going to take these feelings and put them in a song. And we're going to have a revival. And they sure look like they're having one, especially Sam Bush. Can you imagine Bill Monroe carrying on like that? Or dressed down like that? On the other hand, the best-dressed guy is playing an electric bass with his hair feathered out, as is only appropriate for the early 80s. But these guys were consummate musicians, and they were taking their instruments, a mandolin, guitar, it was an acoustic banjo, I stand corrected, and really stretching them, seeing what they could do, taking them into places musically that they had not explored before. So, gone are sort of the traditions both in terms of performance style, in terms of dress, in terms of musical material. All right, they've got the long hair, informal clothing. They also, like Old and in the Way, are listening to contemporary music. They're doing covers of Jerry Lee Lewis's Great Balls of Fire and Beatles songs as well. So everything was up for grabs. So the education, their background is totally different from that of the previous generation of musicians. All right. Another area being explored by bluegrass musicians in the 70s and 80s is kind of what I've referred to before as the cosmopolitan Nashville sound. And some bluegrass musicians definitely found it advisable and lucrative to go to Nashville and become country singers and players. And here's a wonderful example. Is a young man named Ricky Skaggs, who had his debut with Bill Monroe, I think at something like the age of 5, when at the Opry, and friends of Ricky's had said, "You got to hear this kid, you got to hear this kid," and he pulled him up on stage, and he played with him, and he's been playing bluegrass ever since. I mean, Bill Monroe, literally picked him up and gave him his start. But here we are now, 70s, pushing 80s. Now look, I think he borrowed Vassar's belt there. He's got this great album, Don't Cheat in Our Hometown, and what I'm going to play for you is the title cut. And this is actually an old Delmore Brothers song. So the material is actually going way back to the brothers' duets that we talked about in The Roots of Bluegrass. He himself is a bluegrass musician, raised up by Bill Monroe. But now the sounds that you're going to hear are totally contemporary country. You've got a drum set, you've got pedal steel guitar, this kind of weeping sound that makes you cry to every country song you hear.
Tonight my heart is beating low and my head is bowed. You've been seen with my best friend on the other side of town. I don't mind this waiting, don't mind this run round. But if you're gonna cheat on me, don't cheat in our hometown.
There you go. Good advice. All right. So there were some other players. I want to do a little feature on a musician you heard about, I think, last week when Betsy Rome was talking about the guitar. I want to focus in a little bit on Mr. Tony Rice. Tony Rice, who's still with us, though he's currently in quite ill health. And Lynn Lipton had mentioned in the last couple of weeks that there was a wonderful article spread about Tony Rice in the New York Times Sunday magazine, kind of recounting his career and also his current travails, and especially the inspiring support and rallying round by the broader community of musicians and friends to help raise money for Tony's medical needs. But when he was at the full height of his powers in the 70s, he hooked up with another old friend of ours by the name of David Grisman. Grisman, again, who was on the New York scene at the folk revival, who's there with Jerry Garcia doing Old and in the Way, and is still around to this day, still performs, plays at festivals and concerts. In fact, his own son is now a musician, a very successful bassist. But David Grisman is a mandolin player and composer who's, again, such a unique songwriter and tunesmith that he and his friends have labeled his style of music dog music, D-A-W-G, dog, as in D-O-G, but Southern, dog. Dog music, that's his nickname, David Dog Grisman. And I want to play for you an excerpt from the David Grisman Quintet, which included guitarist Tony Rice. They are looking even broader afield for musical inspiration. And this came out in 1977, and the tune is called Minor Swing. There he is. There's a little picture. Okay, so there he is, Tony Rice, marvelous portrait. That was the article, and the clip you're going to hear is from the David Grisman Quintet of 1977. The song is Minor Swing, written by Django Reinhardt and Stéphane Grappelli, who were French jazz musicians inspired by Louis Armstrong and Fats Waller, but who didn't have horns and pianos. They had string instruments. Django Reinhardt was a gypsy musician and guitarist. Stéphane Grappelli, one of the greatest violinists, I don't know if we could honor him with the term fiddler. I don't know if he would take it as an honor, but he was a consummate violinist and fiddler. And this tune is called Minor Swing. So drawing back to the 1930s, but a totally different musical heritage than the one Bill Monroe built on. All right, so you can hear kind of that jazzy inflection, the incredible speed. I mean, this is, again, incredibly difficult to execute this music. It's breakneck speed, but with a totally different character, flavor, and sensibility than the high tempos that we've encountered in the classic bluegrass previously. All right, so at the same time, you have all this kind of innovation and ferment and exploration, looking to new sources and new styles. You also have due deference and respect paid to the mainline tradition of bluegrass music as Bill Monroe and his colleagues first presented it. And so this is something I'm sort of terming neo-traditionalism. So all these folks who listen to jazz, old jazz records, old rock records, were also listening to old Bill Monroe records. And Tony Rice himself, as did pretty much every one of these musicians, David Grisman did a traditional album, Tony Rice did a traditional album, they all kind of go back and establish their bona fides. Or maybe another way of thinking of it is getting back in touch with their roots and finding that the old music has a new interest when you come to it from your travels afar. Okay. So this is a band put together featuring Tony Rice, but every one of these guys is a top name in bluegrass. Pretty much was then and certainly is now. You have J.D. Crowe on the banjo, Tony Rice on guitar, Doyle Lawson on mandolin, Bobby Hicks on the fiddle, and Todd Phillips on bass. And they just threw their names up there and said, this is the Bluegrass album. So, well, people didn't know what to make of that. So from there on, that lineup came to be known as the Bluegrass Album Band, because they needed a band name. And they did. They kind of went back and stripped down their production. You know, they're not using any unusual instrumentation. They're using traditional music, traditional bluegrass tunes, and just having at them with everything they're worth. So here's a nice piece of footage of them performing. And there's one extra guy, a second fiddler at the far end. His name is Vassar Clements. And the tune is Blue Ridge Mountain Home, about as close as you get to a staple bluegrass tune.
There's a well-beaten path on this old mountainside where I wandered when I was a lad. There I wandered alone to the place I call home in those Blue Ridge hills far away. Oh, I love those hills of old Virginia. From those Blue Ridge hills I did roam. When I die, won't you bury me on the mountain, far away near my Blue Ridge Mountain home.
Vassar's in a full suit, matching pants and jacket and everything. So anyway, so you see that it was not an either or for most people. It was a both and. I mean, really, great musicians tend to be hungry for as much music as they can get their ears and fingers on. So I have a few other things I wanted to touch on. One is a seminal album that was referred to, I guess again, by Betsy last week, called Will the Circle Be Unbroken? It was an album basically hosted by the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. All right, you saw this album cover. I think Betsy Rome had brought in the actual triple album LP. And some of our old friends are here. Vassar Clements joins in on fiddle. Earl Scruggs is playing banjo on some of these tracks. Mother Maybelle Carter, the only remaining original Carter family member still active. Norman Blake, who I mentioned earlier, a collaborator of John Hartford's. We also have people like Roy Acuff, old Opry stars, early country music. I'm trying to think who else. Merle Travis, Doc Watson, all of them fabulous musicians. And they came in and they kind of mixed and matched. It was hosted by the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. These are West Coast players. But they basically brought in all their heroes who would answer the call. There's a notable absence on this record, which is Bill Monroe. And if anyone knows the story, I don't. I don't know whether it was that he was invited and declined or whether they didn't invite him. I would guess that it's the former. So here we have kind of a blend of old and new, young and old, just having a good old time, as you'll hear. This is a song, I'll let Doc Watson do the proper introduction, but he'll explain the song and who's kicking it off.
What shall we do then? I got to work on this a little. I don't know if I can get through it. I wanted to do it today. It's called Down Yonder. It was recorded a long time ago by Gid Tanner and the Skillet Lickers. How does it go, Vassar?
That's why people like to listen to Vassar Clements. All right, and you may have noticed the drums in the background, not your typical Bill Monroe-approved instrument. There's also, in the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, a great harmonica player, also not a traditional instrument. But for those who learned bluegrass from this album, all of that was fair game. Okay, finally, with a couple minutes left here, I do need to talk a little bit about the rise of festival culture. Bluegrass festivals are the way, they kind of derived from the Newport folk festivals. They were kind of modeled on the folk festivals of the early 60s. And they have become the principal way that bluegrass musicians can make a living, that they can travel around. There's no longer kind of the old circuit of barn dances as used to support people like Bill Monroe. Instead, you have these festivals from town to town. And what's nice is the bluegrass audience and the bluegrass musicians, performers, it's a very thin line. In fact, it's not much of a line at all. The same people who are playing on stage at one moment will be sitting in the audience the next. It's a real gathering of tribes, not just performers, but people who want to play, who want to get to know other folks. In the same way that the HVBA hosts monthly bluegrass jams for people to come and play and get to know each other. These festivals draw crowds from ever further away to join in. And some festivals are known as, those are pickers festivals. That's where you go if you want to play. And then there are other festivals that are known for the lineup that's on the stages, that you got to go and you got to catch all the acts because they bring people from far away that you don't otherwise get to hear. So, there are all kinds of camps, and then never mind all the different genres. But the original Bluegrass Festival was founded in 1965 by Carlton Haney with the help of our old impresario and friend, Ralph Rinsler. All right, and this, I think, is from the second Roanoke, Virginia Bluegrass Festival. You can see who some of the acts are. There's Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys, top billing, of course. Jimmy Martin and his Sunny Mountain Boys. Don Reno, who I mentioned was the banjo player on the original Feudin banjos. The Stanley Brothers and the Clinch Mountain Boys are there at the bottom, also on the list, and special guest Doc Watson, who you just heard. So, quite a festival there in Roanoke, Virginia, at Cantrell's Horse Farm, Fincastle, Virginia. All right, at the top right, you'll see a nice photo from the Bean Blossom Bluegrass Festival, Bean Blossom, Indiana. That's why it says back home again in Indiana. And this is Bill Monroe's own Bluegrass Festival. After discovering the success and helping establish Bluegrass festivals as destinations, he established for himself a home turf, the Bean Blossom Festival. And if you go to Bean Blossom, you better polish up your Bill Monroe tunes, because that is primarily what you're going to hear played on stage, and especially what you're going to hear being picked out in the fields. So each festival has its own character, as I said. Finally, we have two titans of bluegrass in the bottom right corner. Who can identify the man on the left, the tall man with the huge paw? White hat? That is Bill Monroe. Very good. Excellent. All right. Now, how about the fellow on the right? Slightly, not quite as grand in stature, but you've actually seen him more often than you've seen Bill Monroe's picture these last several weeks. Can anybody identify that fellow there in the glasses and the white hat? You can look around. He's in this room right now. It is not me. Thank you. That's right. But the glasses are almost the same. That is our good friend and fearless photographer, filmographer, Fred Robbins, right there. And indeed, he is worthy of the applause, both for his efforts here and his incredible work documenting bluegrass from his earliest days, anyway. This is a photo, am I right, Fred, from the second FinCat? I believe that's the same the poster from the same event, although this may be the poster of the first festival. In any event, the photo was the second annual Roanoke, Virginia Bluegrass Festival. So, anyway, with that, I have to cede the lectern here. We have a wonderful musician joining us now to demonstrate for you Bill Monroe's instrument, the mandolin. He's a great musician and a good friend of the Bluegrass Society. He's active throughout the region and nationally. His name is Wayne Fugate.
Good afternoon, everyone. That was very scattered and very anemic. Let's try that again. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. That was much better. A round of applause. And it's with just that kind of enthusiasm that I welcome you here this afternoon to learn about the king of instruments, the mandolin. This is my chosen instrument, despite anything else that you've been told already in this presentation or will be told in future presentations. Just remember, this is the king of instruments. So just a few items of housekeeping and a disclaimer before we get into the meat of the program. My name is Wayne Fugate. I have a very dear friend, also a mandolin player, a guy by the name of Michael Sassano. I've known him for many, many, many years. He's a great guy. We've helped each other a lot musically. If after our time together this afternoon, Lynn or Fred or anyone from the HVBA should ask you your thoughts about my portion of the presentation. If you enjoyed it, I'd like you to remember my name, Wayne Fugate. And if for some unfathomable reason you didn't enjoy it, I'd like you to just tell them, don't ever have that Michael Sassano guy back here again. Okay, so to begin with, a few definitions. We'll talk about what a mandolin isn't, and then what it is. A mandolin is not a ukulele or, oh, I know, it's that little guitar thing. It's not that either. What a mandolin is an instrument that has descended from the lute family. We'll talk more about its history and origins as we get into the presentation, but descended from the lute family, in particular, an instrument called the mandore. It has typically four pairs of strings, so a total of 8 strings on it. each of the pairs is tuned to the same pitch. And so from lowest string to highest string, that would be G, D, A, and E. Okay? So for any of you with a musical background or perhaps some training in violin, you'll recognize immediately that this instrument is tuned in identical fashion to a violin. Okay? In fact, all the left-hand fingerings on this instrument are just as they would be on a violin as well. So lots of similarities between the violin and the mandolin. It's just that we have frets to guide our fingers so that our intonation is oftentimes a little better than the violin players. And we need that in order to compensate for the fact that our bows are ever so much shorter than those of violin players. So we compensate in that fashion. But kidding aside, lots of similarities. You could go so far as to say that literally anything that you can play on the violin, you can adapt and play on the mandolin. Okay? And so like the violin, you're familiar with the fact that the violin is a member of a string family that includes violas and cellos and double basses, etc. So same deal with this instrument. This is part of a family. This is the soprano voice in the family, but we also have some other members of the family as well. This is what the family looks like. This kind of oval-shaped instrument is a mandola. I just happen to have one with me today. This is a mandola. And just like a viola, it's tuned the same as a viola. So C, G, D, and A. You can hear it's a little lower in pitch, right? Kind of that nice kind of voice, you know? So this is the mandola, analogous to a viola. Then this large, strange-looking instrument here in the lower left corner is the mandocello. I don't own a mandocello, but it's tuned an octave below this. So just like a cello would be tuned an octave below a viola. So again, C, G, D, and A. And it's about the size of a guitar, just in case you're having a hard time figuring that out. Now, what I do have in this picture is an octave mandolin. And I brought this along because it's similar in size to what a mandocello might look like. And this is tuned an octave below the mandolin. So again, G, D, A, and E. You can hear it's got a really nice, right? Very pretty, right? I think. So this is my little octave mandolin. Anyway, these are the four primary members of the mandolin family. There are many, many variations on the theme, including one last one that I brought from home that I'll show you for show and tell. This is so exciting for me and my kids. We all get to get out and it's show and tell. Now, I'm not trying to scare or alarm anyone when I bring this next one out. I'm a trained professional. And I use this only in the confines of my house and only on those occasions when I feel the need to channel my inner rock star. But this, ladies and gentlemen, is an electric mandolin and tuned just the same as a mandolin, G, D, A, and E. But it gets very, very loud and extremely obnoxious. My cats have even threatened to leave home on occasion when I've been wailing away on this. So these are, I play with my aforementioned friend Michael, who you should feel free to, again, say bad things about if you don't like my presentation, in a show called Mandolin Madness. And these are kind of a representation of some of the instruments that we bring to the show. You can see my octave mandolin there, and the mandolin and the mandola. That kind of pumpkin-colored instrument in the back on the left is Michael's mandocello. So between the two of us, we've got pretty much all the members of the family. In that preceding slide, that really large, big black thing, that in fact is the mando bass. And there aren't many of them left. They never really took hold Hard to imagine why. An instrument that looked like that. But they were tuned just as a double bass would be tuned. And instead of being played with a bow, they were played with an incredibly thick felt pick. And sounded as terrifying as they looked. So, in fact, many people would say that the mando bass combined the worst elements of the mandolin and the double bass. So there you go. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about the history and the origins of the instrument. Let me put this away first. Okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, the mandolin has a very long and rich history. The first, I guess, representations of a plucked, strung instrument appear in cave paintings dating back, many years BC. The first, documentations of a mandolin-like instrument are of that mandore instrument that I mentioned before. That was kind of a smallish instrument, probably about the size of the mandola. It was strung with gut strings. This was before they had steel strings. And so that's kind of the great grandfather of all the mandolin instruments. The first documented appearance of a steel string, more modern mandolin, takes place early in the 17th century. There were several luthiers and families centered in and around Naples that built the instruments. Colacci, Gervasio, who else? Who am I forgetting? DeSanti, Ferrari, Emberger. All these families focused on building these mandolins more modern than the mandore. And in order to fashion these instruments, they would soak strips of wood, get them wet, bend them over a heating iron, and then get them into shape, and then glue them together to create these bowl-backed instruments. I don't own one of these, but lots of folks find these turned up in an attic somewhere, and they're enjoying something of a renaissance today in classical circles. People that play classical music, in particular on the mandolin, appreciate their very delicate kind of sound. So they were called Neapolitan mandolins, again, because of their origins in Naples, and that was kind of what one looked like there. So now, early part of the 1800s, 1815, right after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the market for mandolins had kind of dried up. The export market for these folks in Italy that were making these mandolins had kind of dried up, and the mandolin kind of went through its own dark ages. Do you see what I did there, Lynn? I'm keeping with the theme of the day, the dark ages. I like to think it's only coincidence, by the way, that I was booked on a day that refers to the Dark Ages. But at any rate, 1815, things had pretty much dried up and didn't kind of heat up again until the late 1800s, when the instrument had kind of already proliferated throughout Europe and then made its way across the Great Atlantic to our country. And there, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, it started to enjoy something of a renaissance. And then this was fueled by a company called the Gibson Company in Kalamazoo, Michigan. They really kind of embraced the mandolin and started to evolve it from the Neapolitan style, those bowl-backed instruments that you saw, to more of a kind of a modern instrument. Typically, instruments in the early 1900s had more of a flat top, and they got away from the bowl back. It was more of a flat back to it, and still an oval hole. Maybe some were starting to experiment with F-style sound holes. These being an example of F-style sound holes, very similar to a violin, as opposed to a round sound hole like you might find on a guitar. So they kind of got away from the bowl backs and started, with more flat-backed instruments, more flat kind of tops. And then as the instrument continued to evolve, and especially as we get into the teens and the 20s in particular, Gibson started thinking, there are so many things in common between the violin and the mandolin. Why don't we apply the construction principles that are used in violin making to mandolins, and instead of just using a flat piece of wood for the top and flat back and sides, we'll carve the top and we'll carve the back out of appropriate tone woods, and we'll start to treat violin making or mandolin making like violin making. So here that's really the genesis of what is today this modern type of mandolin, right? So mandolins typically these days carved top, spruce, some variety of spruce for the top, some variety of maple for the back and sides, and then for the fingerboard, usually ebony, but some folks will use rosewood, things of that nature. So those are the basic elements that go into constructing a mandolin. And Gibson, as I said, was a huge proponent, put a lot of R&D into it, and really helped advance the game from the old bowlback style mandolins to this more modern style of mandolin. Now the difference is that the bowlbacks had a very sweet, delicate sound, but they didn't project very far. This thing, without a microphone, I doubt anyone in the back had difficulty hearing that. It's a very loud instrument. It was designed to project, and those are the principles, the violin principles that aid its ability to do exactly that, and kind of cut through a band and be able to project. So, not content to just pretty much redefine how mandolins are constructed, the Gibson Company in the early 20s hired an acoustic engineer, a guy by the name of Lloyd Lohr. And Lloyd really kind of upped the game yet another level. And his mandolins, he only signed, I think, a couple of hundred of them, fewer than 250 anyway. Many of them still exist, and if you can lay your hands on one, you're holding anywhere, starting point to look seriously at owning a Lloyd Lohr signed mandolin is around $175,000. Not too bad, right? So that's the Gibson Company. The Gibson Company, while Lloyd was there, maybe even a little before Lloyd was there, had a great marketing department. And again, kind of referencing back to the violinistic connection, thought to themselves, look, if we've got this instrument here that's so much like a violin, why don't we create and capitalize on these other members of the mandolin family, and we'll create some really good state-of-the-art mandolas and mandocellos and mando basses. And then, much as you saw depicted in the movie The Music Man, we'll go around the country and we'll visit all the music schools, and we'll pull the music teachers aside and we'll say, hey, sell a bunch of these instruments, and we'll give you a little cash on the side. So music teachers really embraced this, as you can imagine they would. And before long, virtually every school, every city in the country had mandolin orchestras. And here are just a few pictures I found of some of the old mandolin orchestras. And so these were entire ensembles comprised of mandolin family instruments, and some of the more liberal organizations allowed guitars to join them as well. But they had, all these wonderful mandolin family instruments, and they played all kinds of music, everything from ragtime to classical literature, in these mandolin ensembles. Really cool stuff. Now, eventually, over time, many of these went away, but still, pretty much in every major city that you visit, if you do some detective work, you can still find that there are mandolin orchestras in existence. In New York, there's the New York Mandolin Orchestra. They've been around for something like 85 years now, still going strong. Seattle has a very prominent mandolin orchestra. Baltimore has one. They're all over the place, and really cool, really well worth your checking out. Those were the mandolin ensembles that helped to further popularize the instrument in this country, and really to almost an unprecedented degree. And now we get to the part that's Lynn's favorite part, the mandolin in Bluegrass. Dun, 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 dun. And here we see a picture of Bill Monroe's Lloyd Loar mandolin and his beat-up case. And the two, the mandolin and Bill Monroe, are just linked forever. You can't have bluegrass without Bill Monroe, and you can't have Bill Monroe without his mandolin. He grew up really hard. I'm sure you've probably already gotten the Bill Monroe bio, so I'll spare you that. But really was given the mandolin because nobody else in the family wanted to play it, and wound up forging this incredible legacy for himself and this music for us to enjoy. So. What is the role of the mandolin in a bluegrass band, as Bill defined it? First and foremost, mandolin players are part of a time-keeping unit for the rest of the band. We're kind of like the snare drum in the band. So where Eric and the bass player would be emphasizing the downbeat. So if we all clap our hands, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Eric's going to play on 1 and 3, and I'm going to play. So you get the idea, right? He's got the downbeat, I've got the backbeat. The bass player has the downbeat, I've got the backbeat. I'm the snare drum. So that's the role of this instrument within a bluegrass context, the primary role, because in bluegrass, so much of it is centered around, lyrics and singing, that, there's not a tremendous opportunity to use it in its secondary role as a melodic instrument. Most of it is on timekeeping, and so time is very, very important. And by the way, congratulations. By clapping your hands appropriately, you have all passed the entrance exam for mandolin players. So that's a good thing, I think. So we're the timekeepers. We hold the backbeat. We're like the snare drum, and we help to propel things along. Our secondary role is as a melodic instrument, where we'll play kind of contrapuntal lines around whatever the vocalist is doing, little fills, the vocalist will sing a phrase, and when they pause, we'll kind of fill in that space with a little snippet of the melody before the vocalist comes back in. So that's kind of part of the role as well. And then the third function is to take a solo, and in bluegrass music, those solos are often, very much rooted in the melody of the song, right? Now, in newgrass and some of the forms of music that Eric introduced you today, again, I find it interesting that newgrass took place in the Dark Ages, but at any rate, in newgrass, there's more of a liberty to get away from that strict melodic theme and to be free to improvise more in the way that a jazz player might approach a tune, with some liberties taken away from the melody. But in bluegrass, it's all about the melody, right? So, two primary roles: timekeeping, and to a lesser degree, but equally as important, helping out with the melody. This is the man, William Smith Monroe. I actually met him during the Dark Ages, in 1975, I think. My very first bluegrass festival. It was up here in what would later become Gray Fox, but back then was the Berkshire Mountains. And by that point in his career, he had mellowed out substantially, and I was a very scraggly-looking, wiry, hippie-looking thing, and approached him, and he was very, very gracious and very, very nice to me, and I met him several times after that, and always just a perfect gentleman, and could not have been nicer to me. Which I find relief in, because I've heard stories of the more fiery side of the Monroe personality, and I'm glad I was spared that. Eric was telling the story about how Sam and Bill actually had to tour together for a period of time. Bill's band had kind of fallen off a little bit in popularity. The Newgrass Revival, they were kind of the big things, and this is the beginnings of the folk revival, and the promoters thought it would be a good idea to pair Bill with the Newgrass Revival so that younger folks who would come normally to see the Newgrass Revival would hear what the roots were. And that's where that story takes place, right? Their banjo player, I think it was, had taken ill, and Kenny Baker, who played violin with Bill, was a great practical joker, and was trying to talk Bill into giving Newgrass Revival's banjo player a shot, and Bill was hearing none of it. And finally, here comes Sam Bush walking through the room, and Monroe stops him cold in his tracks and says, "Son, what do you call that kind of music you play?" And Sam hadn't even really considered it at the point, and said, "Well, Mr. Monroe, sir, I guess we call that Newgrass." Monroe says, "That's right, I hate that." Many great Bill Monroe stories. At any rate, Bill Monroe's mandolin, great history here. So, as I mentioned, it is a signed Lloyd Loar instrument that he purchased in a barber shop in Florida for the whopping sum of $150. Fast forward many, many years after Mr. Monroe's passing, and it auctioned off. His son, James, auctioned it off for $1.125 million. Not too shabby, huh? So, Monroe didn't always have the rosiest relationship with the Gibson Company, however. In fact, there was a period during his early career, sometime after he had acquired the instrument, that he sent it to Gibson to have some work done on it, to just have the frets leveled and some minor stuff done. And when he got it back, he was really unhappy with the work that Gibson had performed. And as an example of the fiery side of his personality that I just alluded to, he took a penknife and gouged the name The Gibson out of the headstock. In the process of doing that, broke the little scroll off the tuning head, took that same penknife and proceeded to scrape most of the finish off the instrument. And that was his kind of to Gibson for many years. And he played it in this beat-up, horrific condition for decades. And much to the chagrin of the Gibson Company. So in 1985, a jilted girlfriend apparently broke into his home and got a hold of a fireplace poker and just beat the bejesus out of this poor mandolin and really reduced it to a pile of splinters. And so, that's it. This is already after some of the restoration work has been performed. Bill sent it grudgingly to Gibson because Gibson was the only company around that had the technicians and the expertise to even have a fighting chance at putting this instrument back together for him. So he sent it there, and literally one of Gibson's engineers, a guy by the name of Charlie Darrington, worked with splinters and little tweezers and toothpicks of glue and all of that, and literally worked with pieces that small, and managed to put the instrument back together again. But at any rate, finished off the instrument. Bill allowed them to put their name back in the headstock. Didn't want them to mess with the finish. He had a very strong sense of tone and claimed that the best way to get tone into an instrument was to, and I quote, whip it like a mule. So he had whipped this one, and it had great tone. It really did have a singular sound to it. And if you listen to any of Bill's recordings, this is the instrument that's featured on it, both pre-repair and post-repair. And if you develop your ear to the point where you can hear differences in the tone that different mandolins produce, you'll recognize his instrument, a million miles away. It really did have a singular tone to it. Okay, well, we can talk about the different, kind of the things, the stylistic hallmarks of Monroe's playing. Monroe was a guy who really exploited what I'll call kind of the tonal palette that exists on the instrument. And by that I mean that, you can produce different sounds on the instrument relative to where your right hand hits the string. So if you play it back here, you get that very sharp, percussive, biting sound. If you play it up here, it's a far sweeter, kind of more bell-like sound, right? So Monroe is a great one for exploiting all of those different sounds that exist on the instrument. And his approach to taking solos often involved the use of double stops or portions of chords. So he also used a downstroke. Now, most mandolin players will play their melodic lines down and up strokes, but Monroe, for emphasis, sometimes would play a line like, including that blues note, all with downstrokes to really hammer them out and make them that much more percussive and that much more in your face. So lots of double stops, downstrokes. He had a couple of signature licks. Many, many variations of this one exist, but right? That kind of thing. So that's a little bit of Bill Monroe's stylistic hallmarks in a nutshell. In this next slide, I've included some of my fave mandolin players that kind of came more out of the Bill Monroe school than the Newgrass school. We'll get to those guys in a second. But this guy pictured up top here, top left-hand side, Jesse McReynolds. These folks are all mentioned in this handout, and I hope you appreciate the hard work I put into the cover diagram here. Not that I'm trying to make a point or anything. But Jesse McReynolds, so do check these folks out when you're off on your own, looking for things to listen to. Jesse is kind of an innovator in that he decided, I really like the mandolin, but my brother Jim is picking on me. He wants to hear kind of this banjo thing happening. That isn't really true. But he was also influenced greatly by the banjo, so he created a style of playing the mandolin that attempted to emulate or resemble a banjo, and he created the McReynolds style, or the cross-picking style of mandolin playing. So where normally I would play a scale something like that, Jesse kind of blew it out and said, you can kind of hear the banjo roll kind of thing happening on it. So it's an art form that unfortunately lots of modern day mandolin players haven't really embraced. It's really difficult to do well. Jesse is absolutely the master of it, the creator of it. So so I would really, really encourage you. There's one recording of his in particular called Mandolin Workshop. If you can find that anywhere, listen to that. It's a master class in cross-picking. Bobby Osborne, the distinguished-looking gentleman in the hat here, part of the Osborne brothers, Rocky Top. Does that tune sound familiar to you? Yeah, his band helped to write that. Bobby was one of the first guys to approach more of a flowing melodic line away from this kind of his approach would have been more like something like that. Maybe not quite as involved, but Bobby is the guy who started getting us more towards that. Very crystal clear in his attack, clean as a whistle when he played. Highly recommended. And the vocals in that band were killing. John Duffy, dearly departed. He passed away a number of years ago, but he was a seminal figure down in the Washington area, the D.C. bluegrass scene. Started playing with the Country Gentlemen, and then later with the Seldom scene. Had kind of an unorthodox approach to the instrument. Used to like to bend strings when he would take a solo, so he would play that kind of, I guess, influenced almost perhaps by rock guitar players or so on. But John's approach, very distinct and certainly a Hall of Famer by anyone's standards, so definitely check him out. Woodstock resident and proud New Yorker Frank Wakefield, a complete maniac on the mandolin. He started experimenting with alternate tunings and different ways of playing melody with chord accompaniment going on at the same time. He really, what went on in that guy's head and still does, pretty amazing. So definitely another guy to check out. This gentleman here in the middle, Herschel Sizemore, one of my all-time favorite mandolin players. This guy, just hard to beat for for anything. He had just more again of the kind of melodic, more notey approach. That would be his take on Cherokee Shuffle. That's pretty close to the way he played it, I think. So, great mandolin player. Doyle Lawson, who Eric mentioned earlier when he was talking about the Bluegrass album band, famous for his the vocals that his band created. But Doyle's approach to mandolin playing is also tremendously inspiring. Buck White from Texas. This guy comes at it from more of a kind of Western swing, kind of Texas-y approach. More of a Western swing, Texas-y approach, but it definitely, has bluegrass sensibilities around him. He wrote a tune, a favorite of mine, called Buck's Run, that's supposed to resemble hounds out on a hunt. And you can tell I haven't played it in forever either. But anyway, this opening line, you can almost hear those hounds, right? Buck is a great mandolin player. A gentleman whose birthday it is today, Roland White. Roland was a frequent guest on the Andy of Mayberry show, not as part of the Darlings, but as part of Kentucky Colonels. He played with his brother Clarence, and in that band, and they were tremendously influential. Clarence went on to grow his hair long and play with a band called the Byrds that many of you have probably heard of. Anyway, Roland, great mandolin player. Ricky Skaggs, Eric mentioned in his comments earlier today. Mike Compton, probably the greatest proponent of keeping that driving, percussive Monroe style of mandolin playing alive today. Mike, if you want to hear what Bill Monroe sounded like when Bill was, in his prime, Mike is that guy. Ronnie McCoury, another big kind of Monroe school proponent, plays blisteringly fast, plays with his father Dell, and Dell used to play in Bill's band. Dell was a vocalist and a guitar player in Bill's band, so Ronnie really grew up with it. Adam Steffi and Sierra Hull. I included Sierra here just, it started occurring to me as I was putting these pictures in. God, this looks like a boys' club, doesn't it? In truth, more and more women are coming to the instrument now, and Sierra is absolutely, frighteningly, phenomenally good. Sierra and Tim O'Brien played for many years in a band called Hot Rise. Great group. Not together formally anymore, but they still have reunion tours and play at festivals. And if you ever have the opportunity to see them, they're not only fabulous musically, but they're great entertainers too. So definitely all these guys worth checking out. So this is Bill is famous for his hard driving, very percussive mandolin playing. We're going to play a very pretty waltz that he wrote instead. This is called the Lonesome Moonlight Waltz, and it goes like this. So 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much.